Today, we're continuing our conversation about theistic evolution and the theological implications of how we think about origins. Now, this discussion is one that I recorded several months ago with Dr. J.T. Bridges, who is a professor at Southern Evangelical Seminary. By the way, if you want a great school to further your education, go to ses.edu/Alisa. You can download a free little ebook. It is a wonderful seminary where I have audited many classes. And J.T. Bridges is one of the professors there. And several months ago, as a part of our seminary series, we recorded this discussion about theistic evolution, about intelligent design, about how different systems of thinking are undergirded by different philosophies. So this episode is definitely for my science nerds, for my philosophy nerds. We got deep in the weeds. And at the time we recorded it, it didn't really seem to fit with the rest of the series. So I've been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment to release this episode. And you guys loved my last episode with Dr. Tricia Scribner about theistic evolution. So I thought this would fit in perfect with that discussion to just take us a little deeper and go a little further into the philosophy that undergirds a lot of these discussions. So there are so many highlights for me about this conversation. I think primarily really understanding what we're talking about when we use phrases like intelligent design, even the phrase evolution. Dr. Bridges defines that for us. And then we talk about the theological implications of these things and ultimately how we can think through our philosophy of science. Because one of the things that was really relevant to me when I was first thinking these things through many years ago is the idea that, you can have different scientists that come to different conclusions because they're all doing philosophy. But as we discussed in today's episode, scientists aren't often trained in philosophy. So they can actually make philosophical mistakes that can lead to erroneous conclusions. So Dr. Bridges is going to break all of that down for us today. And here is my discussion with Dr. Bridges. Dr. Bridges, great to have you back on the show. I am very excited for this conversation, but I'll admit to you that I'm also a little bit nervous for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're going to be talking about two disciplines that are probably my weakest disciplines, and that's philosophy and science, and more specifically, philosophy of science today. So I am going to be, like many maybe who are listening, going to be hanging on to this conversation by my fingernails, doing my best to understand. But I do understand enough about it that it's very important because I think for the average Christian, they hear phrases like Big Bang. They hear phrases like evolution. They hear phrases like macro versus microevolution, intelligent design, philosophy of science, and it can all be very confusing. And I remember, I'm a simple person, and I remember years ago hearing Frank Turek give a talk about science, and he said something that I think summarizes a lot of what we're going to be talking about here today. And what he said was, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. And what he was ultimately getting at is that science isn't just this kind of unbiased neutral thing. It requires philosophy. Scientists actually have to take the data and filter it through different analytical systems, and we're going to be talking about a couple of those and ultimately what the philosophy is that most scientists are doing science under and how that relates with intelligent design and how we can approach the idea of Darwinian evolution as Christians. So I'm so glad you're on the show to talk about this. There's nobody better or more capable. Before we get into it, tell us a bit about yourself and what you teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and then we'll get into it.
Sure. Happy to be back, Alisa. At Southern Evangelical Seminary, I teach some of the higher level philosophy classes and some of the PhD seminars. At the grad level, I teach metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics is the study of being. Epistemology is the study of theories of knowledge. How do we know what is knowledge, truth and error, things like that. Theology proper, which is the attributes of God and his creation. And then a PhD level seminar on God and science. So that's probably the handful of classes that I teach there.
Very good. And in today's episode, generally I try to avoid using big words, but we're going to have to today. So we're going to do our best to define them as we go along. But I do think that for the average person, this is going to be very relevant. And we're going to get into that very early on. But first, I want to just define, what are we talking about when we say the word evolution or evolutionary theory? Because I think we will agree there are elements of evolutionary theory that we would agree with. So, but typically Christians hear that term and we think, oh, that's against Christianity. And I ultimately think what they think we're talking about is against Christianity, but we're going to define the term. So, what is evolutionary theory?
Yeah. So the term evolution, as you pointed out, can just outside of a scientific context can just mean change over time. We could talk about the evolution of the rules of the NBA and how they've changed over time, right? So that's not problematic. It's fairly generic. Then there's within biology, there's a distinction between macroevolutionary theory and microevolutionary theory. Microevolutionary theory is just micro meaning small, small changes within a species as it interacts with its local environment. We think of Darwin's finches, right? Finch beak sizes change according to whether or not there's a drought in the area for several years. And then once the drought is over, those uh, beak sizes transform back. That's a it is a change within a species over time. It's a small adaptation given a changing environment. And then there's the more radical macroevolutionary theory. Macroevolutionary theory is typically what we think of when we think of Darwin's evolutionary theory. And it's that species can transform, not just change in a limited way in a response to their local environment, but they can, over geologic time, these small changes can turn into large changes such that one species can actually transform into another species over hundreds of millions or tens of millions of years.
Right. Okay, that's good. So let me relate this to something in my current life. So I got into beekeeping about a year ago and just got super obsessed with it, watching all the documentaries, reading all the books. And so there's different schools of thought in beekeeping. But one of the things that happened in the 80s was the introduction of what's called the varroa mite, which is one of the pests that is the most dangerous for bee colonies. And it can cause all kinds of viruses. Well, when the varroa mite came into the United States in, I think it was 1987, there were people who said, let's just let the bees naturally adapt instead of introducing all these treatments. And so the ones that, and by the way, this is kind of how it was shown to be true in Sweden and in certain places in Latin America where they didn't give the bees any chemical treatments. The bees that could not resist the varroa mite died. And so a lot of colonies died. But what that meant was the ones that survived had certain genetic tendencies to be able to handle the varroa mite. They could clean the varroa mite out of their hives. And so in places like that, the bees were naturally stronger and more adapted to varroa mite. So that's kind of what we would call natural selection. So in a certain sense, I would say I am all for evolution if what you're talking about is natural selection, change over time, breeding genetics that are going to be stronger for a certain thing. Totally fine with that. But when you're talking about speciation, where the Darwinian paradigm might say, that bee could actually turn into something else. That is what we're saying is problematic for Christians. And so would you agree with that characterization?
Well, I would say even more specifically that whether or not it's problematic for Christians, that is part of the debate.
Right.
Because
Okay, good.
you have some Christians who think that Darwinian evolution, macroevolutionary theory, neo-Darwinism is a scientific fact. Christianity is also true, and so we have to, like we do um, the heliocentric model of the solar system, we have to adapt our theology in order to embrace what we know to be scientific fact, right?
Right.
So there are theistic evolutionists who think that evolution was the mechanism by which God naturally transforms his creation from one order to to the other, and and then there are those who like you and me. There are people who think that that's problematic for a variety of reasons, either
Hmm.
theologically or sort of text analysis, like somebody like a Dr. Tom Howe might, because of his biblical studies background, might have a problem with the scientific theory. I chose to come at the scientific theory in terms of epistemology and the philosophy of science rather than an evidentialist approach. Um, yeah, so I think there are reasons to be skeptical about of neo-Darwinian macroevolutionary theory.
Hmm.
Um, but the question then becomes, how and why do you justify that skepticism? How is
Hmm.
that skepticism or that sort of common sense incredulity, is what Thomas Nagel says. Um, Thomas Nagel's a atheist philosopher of mind who doesn't think Darwinism is correct, and he just says, "I don't have a religious bias here. I just have this sort of common sense incredulity that what the theory proposes to explain, it actually does explain."
Right.
Um, so we're not we're not anti-science in questioning this particular theory for a variety of different reasons.
Right. Well, let's talk about what's under attack for the Christian if the Darwinian evolutionary theory is true. Like, what's at stake here? Because as you mentioned, there are people that would say, "Hey, I'm a Christian, but I think the way that Darwin explained this is a fact," like you said, and somehow they can make that work with Christianity. I don't think it works with Christianity. I'm not saying somebody's not a Christian if they believe that, but for the gospel to be true, I don't see how that could work. But what do you think is at stake here for the Christian?
Yeah, and I would say that there are atheists like Richard Dawkins on the other side of the equation who actually agree with us that evolution is problematic for Christianity, and that is one of the reasons why he denies Christianity.
Mm,
Right? So we think it's problematic for Christianity, so we question Darwinism. He thinks it's problematic for Christianity and questions Christianity. Right?
right.
Not to point at myself when I talk about
Yeah.
Christianity. Um, but what? So the question is, what is at stake? And that is, um, one of the things that unites Christians, as much as we debate amongst ourselves on things, the thing that unites us is the truth, the validity, and the value of the cross. The things that Jesus died for and redeemed in his death and resurrection, life, death, resurrection. But the value of the cross is only valuable to the extent that somebody understands the objectivity of sin, right? Because the Old Testament and the New tells us that our sin is what separates us from God, right? And so God, among other things in Scripture, is painted as the creator and we are his creatures. And that creator creature relationship brings with it a, uh, a responsibility on the side of the creator and obligations on the side of the creature. And if there is no creator, if there is ample scientific evidence to warrant the conclusion that humans are just really advanced Homo sapiens, that we are a product of biological meandering over geologic time and not the product of divine intention, then it becomes almost insurmountable, at least academically or intellectually, to make the case that no, there is a creator-creature relationship, that creator-creature relationship uh, brings with it objective obligations in our beliefs and our behavior, and that those um, that violations of those obligations are what we call sin, and that sin needs a response. And so, for those that are either by disposition or training somewhat disinterested in the God and science question, which is perfectly valid, uh, you have to see that it is an important question, at least broadly speaking, for the culture and for the church.
Yeah.
And those are some of the reasons why.
There are so many reasons I love to partner with Range Leather. First of all, they're a Christian owned and run company that makes American handmade leather bags and accessories right there in their workshop in Laramie, Wyoming. They also guarantee all of their products for life, and this is what they call their forever guarantee. I have a couple of pieces from Range Leather that are so beautiful. I have a tote bag that fits my laptop and a ton of other stuff. The leather is just so gorgeous and it wears in, not out. I also have a clutch that I take absolutely everywhere. It's always in my car. And it just fits everything from my cell phone to some credit cards to cash. They also have some seriously cute hats. If you go to their website, which is rangeleather.com, you'll see that they have cute little trucker hats and beanies that have leather patches on the front. And you can go to rangeleather.com and use my code Alisa for 15% off. Definitely check them out. Rangeleather.com. Use my code Alisa. Let me get your opinion on this because as I've thought through this question, for me, what's at stake, it does come down to sin, but really if you think about for a Christian to adopt a Darwinian sort of paradigm, then what you have to at some point deny is a literal Adam and Eve as a special creation. And and I've heard I know there might be some theistic evolutionists listening to this saying that's a misrepresentation, maybe. But what I think is I've never heard a plausible and satisfactory and persuasive argument that gives you a literal Adam and Eve as a special creation that still maintains the concept of original sin. And then you get to Romans, and Romans 5 is just going to fall apart if you don't have a literal Adam and Eve. Romans 5:12 says, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man." I mean, that's a person, not just a representative of a larger population, but that's one man, and death through sin. And this way, death came to all people because all sinned. And again, I'm not trying to oversimplify. I know that there are theological arguments that are made to try to work all those things together. But it seems to me that without a literal special creation Adam, you don't have really the building blocks for the gospel to even be possible. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I would say even beyond Paul, we have Jesus Christ himself talking about in Luke's genealogy. It goes all the way back to Adam, the son of God, because Adam has God directly as his creator, right?
Right.
And uh, Jesus talks about Adam, he talks about Abraham, he talks about Moses as literal individuals in history. And if we start to question whether or not Jesus gets it right about Adam, it's problematic.
Yeah.
And so I would say that you're right. It embracing a theistic evolutionary model for a Christian, to put it mildly or kindly or charitably, it introduces some fairly fundamental and radical tensions within your theology.
Yeah.
And so you have to be it, if you're going to adopt that sort of framework, you have to be incredibly mindful. You can't just be like, oh, yeah, it's just some sort of, you can't be sort of flippant in the way you embrace or just try and jam the two together, because it causes, like I said, some pretty fundamental and radical tensions in your theology.
Right. Even taking the testimony of Scripture, I did a little research on this a while back, and the Old Testament genealogies, as you mentioned, they treat Adam as a literal person, giving his exact age when his son Seth was born and his exact age when he dies. That's not really how you would treat sort of a mythology kind of character. They also link Adam directly to Noah, and then all the way to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, and all of those are treated as historical people in the Old Testament narratives. And then even in the New Testament, as you mentioned, Luke tracing Jesus' ancestry all the way back to Adam. Paul refers to Adam as historical in 1 Timothy 2, and Jude does as well in Jude 1:14. In Acts 17, Luke writes that God made the nations of men from one man, and he mentioned Jesus himself as well, who alludes to Adam and Eve as literal people in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. And then, of course, in Matthew 23, Jesus refers to the literal murder of Abel, which is Adam and Eve's son. So if Adam and Eve are mythological, well then, what do you do with their sons that are being depicted in this very clearly literal way? And so, with even those books being historical narrative, it seems like you'd have to really try to prefer the Darwinian paradigm and then make Scripture fit into that rather than deriving what you think about it out of Scripture.
Yeah, that's right. And the the force of the argument is only as strong as Darwin is as a science, because Darwinism has sort of taken off in the culture. It underlies things like evolutionary psychology. It's bled into the humanities, right? So
Hmm.
so if we can, but we also want to be intellectually rigorous about this, and not just dismiss the scientific paradigm because it creates a lot of problems with our theology. That's
Right, that's true.
in the same way that we don't ignore atheist arguments or historians who deny, say, the literal Exodus or something like that. We meet the challenge head on, and we do our due diligence, and then we do our best to give an explanation, like Paul in Romans in 1 Corinthians 9. He becomes all things to all men, so that all some might be saved. So we meet them where they are, and then we try and show them a way out of their assumptions to something that's an alternative.
That's very good. And that's what we're hoping to do today. So, what is neo-Darwinism? How is that different from just classical Darwinian evolution?
Yeah, I responded to this in another podcast, and I made the mistake of going down about a 10 to 12 minute rabbit hole. So, having learned that lesson, I'll say this: the difference between Darwinism and neo-Darwinism is that Darwin writes his original work and publishes it in 1859, and this was before the advent of modern genetics, and so Darwin just sort of qualitatively describes what he calls variation within a kind, right? Which in the 1940s, after Mendelian genetics arises, that becomes wedded to Darwinian theory as a way of grounding or understanding what those variations are. Those variations are mutations at the genetic level that natural selection then acts on to adapt a species to its environment better and better, or individuals within that species. And then, like your bees, or not your bees, but the bees in the 80s, the ones who are better adapted, they survive, and that goes on for hundreds of millions of years, and then bees become something other than bees, I suppose.
Right, right. Okay. So we mentioned before that is philosophy that has to be done when science is being done. I think people kind of think about science as being this just very objective, unbiased sort of discipline that is the only way to really know whether or not something is true. But as you point out, and other philosophers have pointed out, it requires philosophy to be able to analyze the evidence. They collect their data. They're going to analyze that and come to different conclusions. This is why different scientists with the same pedigrees can have the same data and come to different conclusions, because it involves analysis, it involves philosophy. And as you've pointed out, there is a philosophical system that is typical of the sciences. And so maybe talk about what that is, and why do you think so many scientists rule out the idea of God just from the start?
Yeah, well, let me answer the first question first. How scientists think about how scientists bring assumptions to bear in their discipline. The first thing to say is this: um, scientists, as scientists, are focused on the data, right? There are certain outline problems that the community is trying to solve, right? So they're focused on the data and the interpretation of the data. But as you said, there are assumptions that impinge on the interpretation of the data, right? Now, something that I said in a panel discussion, name dropping here, with J.P. Moreland and Jay Richards, we were talking about the nature of science, and scientists are largely naturalists. When you're looking at a sort of like a chemical reaction, you're not asking whether or not there are supernatural forces that are at play, right? As a chemist, you're asking, what are the natural phenomena? How am I measuring it? What is the consequence of the reaction? How much of whatever was made? This sort of training habituates someone to think about all of nature. And I had a fairly strong background in the sciences coming out of high school, going into college. And when I first became a Christian, I noticed in myself a really hard time accepting the miracle stories in the New Testament. And I had this conversion experience. I knew my life was changed. I knew that Jesus was Lord and that He risen from the dead. But I still found myself intellectually tripping over these miracle accounts in the New Testament. And so I had to really start to intentionally go back and revise and first of all notice that my background with the study of the sciences lended itself to this assumption of naturalism, that the
Mm.
only thing that exists in the world are natural objects and their interactions. And so scientists, because they're focused on the data and doing their daily job, they're not really asking typically philosophical questions about their discipline. and they're sort of unconsciously habituated into this material or naturalistic metaphysics. So that can be a barrier to faith for some if they're um, if they're unmindful of the fact that they've been habituated into a metaphysical system, not just a, like you said, white coat, objective, dispassionate view of the evidence.
Okay, that's helpful. So, where does intelligent design come in? First, maybe just define that term first of all, and then because today, and again, I'll try to summarize this and tell me if I've gotten this right. What we're going to be talking about is there's this discipline called intelligent design that is an alternative view to Darwinian evolution that doesn't necessarily ish. Okay, he's giving me the ish sign. But it presents itself that way, maybe as a different way to look at things. It presents itself as being kind of unbiased, but I think what you're pointing out is that you're not against intelligent design, but you're saying let's look at the philosophical presuppositions underneath it and let's play by the same rules as the Darwinian evolutionists in order to win them over to say, look, we're not going to assume a theistic worldview. We're going to go ahead and do our science based on the idea that we're just investigating the natural world. And okay, am I close? As America turns 250 years old this year, why not celebrate by subscribing to GoodRanchers.com? I love my subscription to GoodRanchers.com because every single month I get grass-fed beef, better than organic chicken. They also have wild-caught seafood, heritage breed pork. All of that gets delivered right to my door on dry ice, and I put it in my freezer, and then it just makes meal planning so easy. Just the other day, my son wasn't feeling well, and beef stew is his go-to comfort meal, and I didn't actually have stew beef, but I had some bone-in steaks from Good Ranchers. I used those steaks to make the beef stew, and I'm not kidding you, it was the best beef stew that I've ever made. The beef was so tender and delicious, and it makes it so easy because it's just sitting there in my freezer ready to go, and throw in some extra pantry staples that I have laying around, and it just makes meal planning easy, and I don't have to stress about it. Right now, if you subscribe to GoodRanchers.com, you will get a free meat add-on for the life of your subscription plus $25 off your first order. Also, the website is really easy to navigate. All of their customer service is right here in the United States as well. And if you want to pause or you want to skip an order or even cancel your membership, you can do that really easily on the website. So go to GoodRanchers.com today. Use my code Alisa for that free add-on and $25 off your first order. Again, GoodRanchers.com. Use my code Alisa because Good Ranchers is American meat delivered.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I have a copy of Stephen Meyer's Signature in the Cell, and I'll pull that up and just
Yeah,
read his definition of intelligent design. But first, I want to say this: there are evolutionary biologists, zoologist Richard Dawkins that I mentioned earlier is a staunch and devout atheist. Less so these days, but certainly in the early
right. Cultural
2000s.
Christian now, right? Isn't that
Yeah,
what he's saying?
yeah,
That's so
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. As things have begun to impose on Great Britain, he finds himself a little less
Yeah,
a little less animated against
that's,
religion.
yeah, interesting.
Um, but there are, I would say, the majority of working biologists who they just receive they just accept neo-Darwinism as a scientific fact, and they have no reason to question that. And so when I started this project years ago, probably the beginnings of it started when I was a grad student back in Baylor, and I thought there are there are ways that biologists see the data that convince them of neo-Darwinism. Is there a way to go into their view to try and reason them out of it so that so that accepting an alternative to neo-Darwinism at least becomes reasonable? Which is sort of the the motivation behind the whole project. Now,
Yeah.
along the way, I did a lot of other things that we may or may not get to, but yeah. So that's sort of the motivation. I'll get to a definition of intelligent design. This is Stephen Meyer's Signature in the Cell. Uh, all of my books that once had book jackets on no longer do because I find them slippery and annoying.
I take them off as well. I don't like them. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. This is page 4 in the prologue. Stephen says, intelligent design is an evidence-based scientific theory about life's origins that challenges a strictly materialistic views of evolution. Now, there are two things in that definition that are important. Intelligent design is a alternative view of life's origins, not necessarily natural history. And the aim, at least in Meyer's opinion, the aim of intelligent design is to undermine a materialistic approach to evolution. Okay. Now, as I was coming up through grad school and going into my doctoral research, I found two areas of the philosophy of religion to my liking: the God and science question, and then the problem of evil, which we, of course, will not get into today. But in reading, I had read a lot of intelligent design literature: Philip Johnson, Michael Behe, Meyer, Dembski, Doug Axe, Michael Denton, a lot of these guys. And then I realized that most of my understanding of evolutionary biology came through the intelligent design guys. And I thought, well, that's not charitable. I need to read the evolutionists for themselves. And so I started reading. I went back and read Darwin's Origin, and then I read some of the guys from the it's called the Modern Synthesis in the 1940s. So guys like Ernst Mayr and Theodosius Dobzhansky were kind of pioneers in the neo-Darwinian view, putting genetics together with sort of older Darwinian theory, and then up through Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, and then anyway. So as I was reading these two different bodies of literature, it really struck me that there's a real talking past one another here.
Mm.
And having a strong interest in the philosophy of science, I had a bit of a different perspective on what was going on, because philosophy of science, if we want to go there now, philosophy of science is really a way of looking at the history of the sciences and sciences as scientific theory. So theoretical change over time. So somebody like Thomas Kuhn and his structure of scientific revolutions. This is the philosophy of science. It's not interested in the data per se. It's interested in, I heard one description that the philosophy of science is like the philosopher looking over the shoulder of the scientist and trying to understand what the scientist is doing and why in philosophical categories rather than scientific ones. So somebody like Thomas Kuhn is going to develop a philosophy of paradigm change, or what we might call the scientific revolutions, right? And Kuhn talks about the fact that when a paradigm is maturing, there are going to be anomalies that sit outside of its explanatory framework, right? So every scientific theory has a unique framework to itself. So, for example, the change from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics included radical redefinitions of things like time, space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are not the same things that are at issue with something like paleontology or or natural history. Natural history is going to have its own assumptions about the nature of species change over time, genealogical relationships. How much access do we have to the mode and tempo of the fossil record, things like that. So those are going to be some of the assumptions that are true for natural history specifically. And so somebody like Thomas Kuhn is going to say that as a scientific paradigm matures, there are going to be anomalies that sit outside of that set of assumptions, that explanatory framework. And then as it matures, the most positive thing that it can do is develop within its own principles answers to those anomalies, right? And this becomes the aim and progress of the scientific paradigm. But if a scientific paradigm, as it matures, is unable to answer some of these fundamental and strict anomalies, then it can go into what's called a crisis mode. And this is why Michael Denton in 1985 titles his book Evolution: A Theory in Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
He's specifically picking up Kuhn's language to say there are anomalies arising from the medical sciences and history and mathematics, our burgeoning understanding of biochemistry at the time, right? And these anomalies simply cannot be accounted for on Darwinian principles. And and so in somebody like Denton's mind, the theory was already in crisis 40 years ago.
Right. And there's other scientists that are challenging it, right? Even non-Christian scientists that are challenging it on those grounds, maybe, or?
Yeah. So what I would say is that the assumptions that frame the data have been called into question periodically. So one of the assumptions that frames the data for a Darwinist is the assumption of gradualism, and this goes back to Charles Lyell's theories about geology to the 1830s, that small incremental changes over geologic time can lead up to large changes. Now that's an assumption that Darwin borrowed from his geological theory and brought it into his evolutionary theory. So it still remains the case that, by and large, Darwinian evolutionists think of the fossil record in terms of gradualism. But in the 1970s, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge published a paper called Punctuated Equilibrium, where they said this assumption of gradualism is unwarranted.
Hmm.
We can have just as healthy a view of natural history and reject the assumption of naturalism. Then in the 1980s and 90s, Henry Gee has a Gee Gee has a book called In Search of Deep Time, where Henry Gee calls into question the assumption of genealogical relationships. He says, look, the fossil record is such that we may have fossils, say, in the ancient fish line, that are separated from each other by 20 or 40 million years. And just by the nature of our assumption, we take the earlier fossil and call it the ancestor, and we take the later fossil and call it the ancestor. We take the earlier fossil and call it the descendant, based on some sometimes superficial anatomical similarities. He said, but you have no idea how much time 40 million years is. He says these are just two fossils that the fossil record happened to dump on our doorstep. We don't really know whether or not there is a literal genealogical relationship between fossil A and fossil B. But because they're the ones that we have to hand, and because of this assumption of genealogical relationships between these similar fossils, we just make that assumption. And then Paul Nelson has done a lot of work recently on the tree of life hypothesis. The tree of life assumption is that all plants and animals come back to one initial, lucky cell at the very beginning of biological history. He says that the tree of life hypothesis is breaking down. And then in the early 2000s, and actually where this journey started for me was a book by a guy named Christian Schwab, because I had been racking my brains about, besides the book of Genesis and besides Darwinian evolutionary theory and besides intelligent design, what else could there be, right? And just in terms of conceptual space,
Mm-hmm.
what are the other options? And I ran across a guy who's a chemist named Christian Schwab, and he has a book called The Genomic Potential Hypothesis. And given my a few years of studying chemistry, what Schwab says is this, and I'll paraphrase. At the very most fundamental level, evolutionary theory is at odds. The biology of evolutionary theory is at odds with the chemistry that it presupposes.
Mm.
Evolutionary theory presupposes a chemical origin of life. And Richard Dawkins says this in one of his books. He says the origin of life is the discipline required to understand the origin of life is chemistry. It's not mine. He says, I'm a zoologist, but somebody like a zoologist is just going to assume a chemical origin of life, right? That from the principles of chemistry, life arises. Okay. Now, if you keep it stated generically like that, what's the problem, right? But if you drill down and become more specific, like Schwab does, who's a chemist, he says this: Darwinian theory relies on the idea that the tree of life comes back to one cell, right? And that's because Darwin is theorizing in the mid 19th century, in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. And for them, biology started at the cellular level. This was the early stage of microscopes, right? They really didn't understand that the cell is a complex city in and of itself in terms of
Right. Yeah.
organelles and DNA, right? So what Schwab says is if life started from a chemical reaction, it would never have had numerically one outcome because chemical reactions run at the molar scale. A mole is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, right? It's the amount of any element's atomic weight in grams. So so carbon has an atomic weight of 12. So 12 grams of carbon would be 1 mole of carbon, 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd carbon atoms, right? That was mind-blowing to me, that if you look at the principles of chemistry, that chemistry and chemical reactions go off on molar scales, then the origin of life would have been a molar level event. It would have never been numerically one
Hmm.
outcome. So what Schwab proposes is that diversity, biological diversity, the variety of species that we see, is not the product of what he calls biological meandering over geologic time. It's actually an initial condition. Now, Schwab is a naturalist,
Hmm.
but he thinks that this follows logically, directly from the assumption of a chemical origin of life event. If life was a purely naturalistic chemical origin, then the diversity that we see, the biodiversity that we see in the fossil record and currently, is a product of the slight variations, not at the genetic level over geologic time, but at the chemical level at life's very first inception.
So are you when you're talking about the chemical that he's talking about, are you talking about the Big Bang?
No. I'm talking about the primordial ooze,
Okay. Okay.
right? So Big Bang is the entire cosmos.
Yeah.
Uh, the origin of life question is just what were the conditions on early Earth
Okay,
that would
got
have
it.
allowed for a chemical reaction to produce first life.
A few weeks ago, I had the founder of Foundation Worldview Curriculum, Elizabeth Urbanowitz, on the show. And I got to tell you guys, this was one of the most highly rated shows just in regard to the feedback from parents. It was so overwhelmingly positive. So many parents were so encouraged and blessed and instructed by Elizabeth's wisdom. And you can benefit from that on a deeper level by purchasing one of her Foundation Worldview curriculums. I love the biblical worldview curriculum from Foundation Worldview because it really helps train our kids answer basic questions like, what is truth? Who is God? How did life begin? What does it mean to be human? How can I tell right from wrong? And what's so great about this curriculum is it can be easily implemented in your home, your church, or your Christian school. So go to foundationworldview.com today and use the promo code Alisa for 10% off of any family, church, or Christian school license. Again, go to foundationworldview.com and use my code Alisa. Okay, got it. So with intelligent design, I know didn't a couple of design guys even endorse your book. So there's friendly back and forth there, right? And so it seems like intelligent design has done a good job of maybe undermining confidence in Darwinian theory as far as causing people to kind of doubt its validity from the
Yeah.
evidential perspective. But what I think you're saying is that they're not really coming up with an alternate model. Is that maybe your beef with ID?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I said earlier that in 1985, Michael Denton's Evolution of Theory in Crisis, in the very title of the book, or the subtitle, I should say, Denton recognizes something like um, that we have to account for this debate at the level of paradigms, scientific theories. Early on in Philip Johnson's Darwin on Trial, he references Thomas Kuhn, and then as intelligent design, as a community and as a coherent way of combating Darwinism, takes off in the late 90s and early 2000s. They tend to leave behind the philosophy of science aspects of the debate, and then you have because what they end up doing is calling into question the empirical evidence itself. So Michael Behe in his Darwin's Black Box makes the case that there is no solid Darwinian explanation for things like the blood clotting cascade, um, uh, or the way that photons are converted in the eye to the optic nerve, or the bacterial flagellum. Right, there are these biochemical systems that are fragile, and they require uh, a coming together, an interconnectivity of parts that defies sort of a trial and error building up over time. So Behe makes that argument. William Dembski, in his design inference, challenges the nature of the information involved at the level of molecular biology and genetics. Stephen Meyer questions Darwinism on sort of logical historical grounds, but also things like significant anomalies like the Cambrian explosion. That 560 million years ago, there was an explosion of a bunch of different complex uh, body plans, phyla. Darwinism wouldn't have assumed that, it wouldn't have predicted that, and it doesn't explain it very well. And
Mm.
so intelligent design really over 30 or 40 years mounts up a significant offense in terms of calling into question all. It really assails the Darwinian dogmatism that this is
Hmm.
a scientific fact. There's no reasons to disagree with it as a scientific fact, right? And so they tend to leave behind the other considerations in the debate, which are more abstract, more theoretical, more philosophical, the things that they tended to be aware of early in the debate, and then left aside. And then the popular billing for intelligent design is that you've got a Darwinian macroevolutionary theory explanation of the history or the history of life, natural history, but there's this Christian or Christian apologetics alternative, and that is intelligent design.
Hmm.
And uh, as I was, like I said, reading through the body of these two different bodies of literature, I thought these guys are violating deep principles in the history and philosophy of science. And one of those principles is that you can't overthrow a paradigm unless you replace it with another paradigm, right? Thomas Kuhn says that if you were to get rid of one paradigm without replacing it with another paradigm, you would be essentially giving up science itself.
Hmm.
And then you see all of this opposition arise to intelligent design from the biological community. And this request happens over and over. That is, if it's not Darwinian theory, what is the other theory? And they say, well, it's intelligent design. And intelligent design, and this is the conversation I had with Casey Luskin. Casey Luskin works for the Discovery Institute.
Hmm.
Stephen Meyer and Casey Luskin both endorsed my book. And
Yeah.
I warned Casey, I said, Casey, I'm critical of ID at the beginning, and I'm welcoming of ID at the very end. And we'll see how that happens. But um, yeah, so intelligent design, it doesn't explain the fossil record. It doesn't explain the increasing complexity from simple to more complex organisms. It doesn't explain morphological or anatomical similarities between species. It doesn't explain genetic similarities between species. And so there's a body of evidence that Darwinists will point to as the thing that their theory explains. And at least William Dembski admits that he tacitly admits, he explicitly says, maybe the panda's thumb did come about by evolutionary processes, but evolution still can't explain the information-rich structures at the level of molecular biology and genetics. So intelligent design has really staked its claims at the level of molecular biology and genetics and information theory. It's highly mathematical, at least in Dembski's version of it. It's very
Hmm.
mathematical. Stephen Meyer actually looks at the DNA as a code, how it functions as a code, and that implies a rational intention rather than sort of mindless natural forces. All of that stuff is good and well, but it's still not an alternative to neo-Darwinism in the sort of history of science sense.
Right.
It doesn't take up the same evidences that the old paradigm did, explain those, and then explain some of the anomalies, which is kind of how scientific revolutions happen. And so in my own research, I thought, okay, I went back to, because one more quote from Stephen Meyer. I tend
Yeah.
to think the way I write, and I write with quotations in mind. So Stephen says this in his prologue to Signature in the Cell. He says, in The Origin of Species, Darwin accomplished many things. He introduced a new framework for understanding the history of life. So Darwin actually receives a view of natural history from we would call him a staunch theistic young earth creationist named William Paley at the turn of the 19th century. And Darwin, there's an article that I have from the History of Science that says, on the day that Darwin published his Origin of Species, he wrote a letter to a friend, and he mentioned William Paley's Natural Theology. And about the book, he said, I've read it so many times, I could have quoted it by heart. So Darwin genuinely has William Paley's Natural Theology in mind as he's writing Origin of Species.
Hmm.
And if you read William Paley's Natural Theology and then you read Origin of Species, you can see how Darwin structured his argument to combat things like the watchmaker argument, or it's from Paley that we get this objection that for Paley says the most sophisticated technology we have for sight is the telescope, and yet the eye is much more complex than the telescope. How could we believe that the telescope was invented, but the eye came about by natural causes? It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, Darwin gives an argument as to how it's possible that the eye could have come about by natural causes in his Origin of Species. So when I read Meyer, and he said that one of the things that Darwin does is he introduces a new framework, a new conceptual framework for understanding the history of life. Okay. This is a book by Ram Hare, and it's called The Philosophies of Science, 1984.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what Ram says about the nature of the philosophy of science. He says, any set of concepts we choose, no matter how much they may lack systematic connection, involves metaphysical, epistemological, and logical assumptions. One aim of the philosophy of science is to make these kinds of assumptions explicit by exploring the concepts that are being used. If the assumptions are known, they can be changed out systematically, explicitly, and controllably. And then he says, the explicit identification of the structure and components of one's conceptual system release one from bondage to it.
Hmm.
And so I thought, okay, Meyer just said that Darwin introduced a new conceptual framework for natural history. Ram Hare says that it's one of the things the philosophy of science does is it picks out the structure and content of these conceptual assumptions, And then if we know what the assumptions are, we can change them out systematically and explicitly. So what I do in my book, which is a modification of my dissertation,
And is
is I
this,
look.
I want to say here, is this called Beyond Origin, a post-Darwinian design theory?
That's right.
Yeah. So
Post
you're offering the
Darwinian.
model. Yeah. That you think.
Yeah, that's right. So
Yeah.
post Darwinian just means what comes after Darwin,
Yeah.
right? And what I said, remember, I mentioned the 1970s and 80s and 90s and early 2000s, that some of these scientists who are not Christians are calling into question each of these major assumptions that frame a Darwinian paradigm. And what Harari just said is that if we identify what those assumptions are, we can change them out systematically. And my contention in the book is that all of the component parts of a non-Darwinian or post-Darwinian theory are in the scientific literature. We just have to put them together in one place, and it becomes apparent, at least it became apparent to me, that there's already the pieces and parts of an alternative in place. We just have to put them together in one coherent conceptual framework,
Yeah.
and then we can have at least a theoretical alternative to neo-Darwinism that intelligent design simply doesn't offer right now. It's an alternative view of natural history. And then once we do that, that's why we said, what was the subtitle of my book?
A post-Darwinian design theory.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so my mind's going all over the place. Yeah, so with Gould and Eldridge and Henry Gee and Christian Schwab and their scientific theorizing in place, if we put those assumptions, if we change them out systematically and explicitly, we put them in one place rather than spread them out over the 70s, 80s, and 2000s, right? You just sort of collect them in one place. What we have are the makings of a post-Darwinian theory that is built off of the kinds of assumptions and approaches that are from the naturalistic scientists themselves. Then we ask the question whether or not a naturalistic view of this new post-Darwinian theory is superior or inferior to a theistic view. And that's where we reintroduce all of the intelligent design material. So Stephen Meyer says that intelligent design is a way of looking at life's origins, the origin of life. He doesn't say it's an alternative view of natural history. And so what I'm trying to do is fill in that gap. Now, because I'm a nerd, I do it in a very methodical, stepwise manner. That is, I I'm trying to say, okay, what is the best philosophy of science to understand the neo-Darwinism intelligent design debate? And I go, okay, well, in order to establish the best philosophy of science, which is an extension of epistemology, we have to choose the best epistemology. And because I'm a Thomist, that is, I follow Thomas Aquinas
Mm-hmm.
in most of his major philosophical intuitions. I said, okay, well, how do we take Aquinas's version of what some people might understand as direct realism, and then build from that a philosophy of science that then can address the neo-Darwinism intelligent design debate. And this
Okay,
actually satisfies.
real quick, let me pop in just to make sure
Yeah,
we're not losing anybody. When you're talking about epistemology, epistemology is the philosophy that has to do with what we can know, right?
that's right.
So that's how we like. I guess maybe a simple way I could put it, and you can correct me if this isn't the right way to say it, but a lot of people do epistemology, they just don't realize they're doing it. So it's if you're careful about how you can claim to know things or how you come to know things, that's epistemology. And so when you and sometimes that'll be juxtaposed with ontology, which is the study of being. So
That's
what
right.
something actually is and how we can know that it is maybe is the difference between epistemology and ontology. How'd I do there?
Yeah, great. Yeah, that was great.
Okay, good.
So ontology, ontos is being in Greek, and so ontology is a study of being. Episteme, there are different words for knowledge, but episteme is one of them. So epistemology is a study of knowledge,
Hmm.
and uh, there are different ways to look at a philosophy of the sciences. There's a book by 2019, Aristotle's Revenge,
Hmm.
by Edward Fazer.
Yes, and actually reading, the one that really helped me, I mean, I still don't feel like I could probably articulate it. You know, like when you read something and it doesn't make sense, and then you read something and it make sense, but you still can't explain it. I'm kind
Sure.
of in that phase with that, but his book, Fazer's book, the Refutation of the New Atheists, the first 4 chapters of that book, he gives a very easy to understand, or at least easier to understand view of Thomistic realism, like that you're talking
Mhm.
about there. And that's when it first kind of started to click for me. So maybe explain what that is for people. When you, what is realism? What does that mean? And then maybe
Okay.
what does Thomas Aquinas bring to realism? How it applies to what we're talking about today?
Okay. Yes. Good question.
Have I
Trying to
stumped
organize
you?
my thoughts. Well, I'm trying to organize my thoughts because this is
No,
supposed
because
to
it's
be.
very complicated. I realize, yeah, we could do
Yeah.
like 2 whole episodes, like 2 hours
Right.
just on Thomistic realism, but we've said it, so I don't wanna lose
Yep.
anybody.
Yep. You've thrown down the gauntlet. Okay. Um, so in metaphysics or ontology, which you introduced,
Yeah,
uh,
and meta means beyond, right? So beyond physical, metaphysics has to do with non-material things, right?
yeah. So metaphysics and ontology, they're two terms for basically the same area of philosophy. It studies reality. So in my metaphysics class that is wrapping up, we study things like causality, the nature of time. What does it mean for a thing to be a concrete particular, like this microphone, rather than an abstract object like triangularity, right? The notion of triangle doesn't matter.
Yeah, I know this. I took critical thinking and I found out
Yeah.
I had to finally drop the class when they started having the discussion that numbers don't exist. And I'm like, this is way over my head for right now. I'm
Fair
in
enough.
deconstruction mode right now.
Right. Yeah. 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 You don't want to be mixing those. So within metaphysics or the study of being, um, there's Platonic realism, which says that abstract objects or real things, numbers really exist. Abstract concepts really exist, like redness, fleetness of foot, things like that. Aquinas's realism is what is called a moderate realism. So in metaphysics, this means that abstract objects don't exist, but common natures exist. So you're human and I'm human because we have something metaphysically in common. But that metaphysical commonality is instantiated in you as an individual and in me as an individual. There's no humanity that floats around out there in a Platonic heaven. So
Right.
that's how Platonism is not Platonism or Platonic realism. It's a moderate realism. And it sort of stands between Platonic realism and then austere nominalism, which would reject that both that abstract objects exist, but also common natures don't exist. Right. So Aquinas is a realist in that sense that common natures exist. But uh, if I can pivot into the sort of realism of the philosophy of science, because it's a good way to distinguish the realism that we're talking about um, in metaphysics is different from the realism that we're talking about in the philosophy of science. And let me say probably first that uh, I and some others in my field think of the philosophy. So think of the philosophy of science as an extension of epistemology. So as I was starting my dissertation in this area, I thought, well, what is science as opposed to politics or art or whatever? Science is a way of knowing. It's a way of knowing and categorizing and analyzing the natural world.
Hmm.
And that means if science is a way of knowing, then philosophy of science is is a philosophy of the way of knowing in a very
Sure.
particular way,
Yeah.
which means that the philosophy of science is an extension of epistemology. So our commitments philosophically about what humans know, how they know, sensation and intellection, and how those things go together, our modes of deduction, which are logic and mathematics, right? How do we use quantity and quality to measure things and then draw conclusions from that? All of those things are very much brought to bear on our philosophy of science. And so as I was trying to think about building a uniquely Thomistic philosophy of science, so using Aquinas's uh, epistemology to then generate a philosophy of science that would be which when I took a class in Aquinas with Eleanor Stump at Baylor. She was a visiting professor, and I asked her very naively what was Aquinas's philosophy of science, and she very graciously said, "Well, he's writing in the 13th century, so he really doesn't have a philosophy of science. There's no real science." And I thought, okay, yeah, that was dumb. But it always stuck with me. If I believe that Thomism is not just good philosophy but true,
Mhm.
then I should be able to extend his principles from the 13th century into the 21st and develop a philosophy of science from them. So that was the first part of my dissertation. But one of the things that informed that was this quote by J.P. Moreland. This is his book, Christianity and the Nature of Science. And he says, oh, for this quote to make sense, I have to make this other point, and
Okay.
that which is kind of where I was going anyway. So, in the philosophy of science, there's a particular debate about scientific theories, and that's a realism anti-realism debate. And the
Right.
realism side of that is what scientific theories tell us is true. That's the epistemological commitment. It's real. That's the ontological commitment. And then the language that our theories use is literal, not metaphorical. That's a semantic commitment. So realism has, by and large, those three commitments about scientific theories specifically, which makes it a philosophy of science. Anti-realism uh, rejects some of those premises. So anti-realists like a David Papineau is going to say that the aim of science is just to solve the puzzles of the day. It doesn't have to be literally true. It doesn't. We don't have to say that these things exist. We just have to use the principles of our paradigm to solve some of the anomalies, and we've done a good job as scientists, right? So Papineau's an anti-realist who thinks that the aim of science is not truth; it's puzzle solving.
Hmm.
Somebody like Bas van Frossen is another anti-realist who says that the aim of science is not to get at truth, but it's rather that that our epistemological commitment about the sciences is not that what the paradigms tell us is literally true. It's that it's consistent. And because it's consistent, it's acceptable. Not true or false, but acceptable or unacceptable because of the way we deal with the evidence according to the principles of the theory. Now, most philosophers of science are what W.H. Newton Smith calls global realists or anti realists. So, somebody like a Papineau or a Van Frossen is going to say science or the sciences in general are either puzzle solving endeavors or empirical constructs, is what Van
Hmm.
Frossen's going to say. Or you're a global realist, like somebody like a Richard Boyd is going to say no. The sciences, their aim is the truth. The things they talk about are real, and the way they talk about them is literally true. So most philosophers of science are global realists or anti-realists, whether you're talking about quantum mechanics or stellar cartography or marine biology, they're global realists or they're global anti-realists. Now, what in that context, J.P. Moreland says this. In my opinion, we are not forced to choose one option or the other. I see no reason why one cannot adopt an eclectic approach to science that adopts a realist or anti realist view on a case by case basis.
Hmm.
So, he goes on to say that even though this is sort of his intuition, he doesn't really know how to flesh it out. But given his study of the realism anti-realism debate, he doesn't feel like we should be we should give a case by case analysis, because I'm a lot less realist with the claim with regard to the claims of quantum mechanics than I am marine biology. I think the I think the gestational time and the migration of whales is much more empirically grounded than what we may or may not say about, positrons, right?
Is that okay? Can I ask you a question though? So I'm trying to hang on here. So I'm not sure what a positron is, but is that because is the reason you're saying that because there's just not as much known about positrons, or because they're more of an abstract object?
Yeah, yeah, good question. So this is actually really helpful for getting into where I kind of wanted us to go, and that is this. Uh, Thomism says that we understand the nature of something by induction. Induction is just seeing the same kind of thing over and over again, right? For an object like in botany or in marine biology, where it's plants and sort of medium-sized animals, I guess whales are a little more than medium-sized, but
Mm.
the object of knowledge is a medium-sized object that's what I call within our natural epistemic range.
Mhm.
We can see it with the naked eye. We can interact with trees and plants over generations, bees over generations, to kind of see how they we can see their life cycle and what they do. And so our sort of robust realism about bees and plants and animals is not based on um, it's not based on a mathematical deduction. It's based on uh, sort of a normal inductive interaction
Observation.
with, that's right, observation and induction, right? Um, as opposed to when we get to things like quantum mechanics. Now, the reason I think we should be some stripe of realist with regard to quantum phenomena is because although we don't, these objects are unobservable in terms of the naked eye. They have to be understood through elaborate instrumentation, but we can run experiment after experiment. The Large Hadron Collider, we can run experiment after experiment, so we can have inductive access to these objects, which have a highly precise quantitative measure. And that's the distinctive, is that quantum mechanics at last look was could make predictions with precision of like to the eighth or ninth place past the decimal point in precision. And so uh, the way John Worrall says it, who's a philosopher of science, he says it would be a miracle if these experiments were as accurate as they are, and the unseen world not be something like quantum mechanical, right?
Okay.
So so the question becomes, if Aquinas is right and that good science is based on induction for medium-sized objects that fall within our natural epistemic range, the induction is robustly empirical, right? uh, Whales and trees and bees, right?
And empirical meaning what you can taste, see, touch, smell,
That's right.
that sort of
Available to the
thing.
sense. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's right. Without any real elaborate mathematical or instrumentational access needed.
Okay.
Um, when we get down to things like physics and chemistry, as those objects recede from our natural epistemic range, the techniques that we use to study them become mathematically precise. So the induction element remains. We're still looking at the same thing over and over again to try and understand its nature. But as it recedes from us, our technology gives us access to a precise quantification of the data, which reassures us that the things that we're calling protons and neutrons and electrons really do have the features that they do because of the experiments we're able to run and the precise quantification of the data, right? So the philosophy of science that emerges from these Thomistic commitments matches up with J.P. Moreland's desire that we have we have principles that we can either be more or less realist or anti-realist on a case by case basis. So I go, well, with things that reside, objects that reside within the natural epistemic range, and the sciences that study those objects, right? Whales and trees and and I can be a robust realist with regard to those things, those sciences, marine biology, botany, right? And then as objects recede from our natural epistemic range, they become very, very small, or they become very, very large and very far away. I can still maintain a thread of realism. It's called structural realism, because even though I don't have the means by which to really directly understand the natures of these things, I can shore up that weakness because the objects themselves lend themselves to a precise quantification of their descriptions, right? So that takes care of many of the sciences and the kinds of realism that we can have. More robust realism, more structured realism or structural realism. And then the question becomes, well, what about natural history? What kinds of objects does natural history study? It doesn't study things that lend themselves to precise quantification, right? We study fragmented bones discovered in layers of the earth. So the objects are medium sized. We don't have inductive access to their natures, their life cycle, their feeding and breeding and migratory habits, right? Oftentimes we have just a handful of examples, and the handful of examples we do have are fragmented and incomplete.
Are you talking about like intermediate forms or
I'm talking about fossils in general.
just fossils? Okay.
Just any kind of fossils that we have. They they the question is, what is the nature of the data? The nature of the data is we have an incomplete, usually skeleton of something that lived in the past that we don't have inductive access to. A guy named David Ropp, who was a paleontologist, wrote an article back in the 1990s, and he said that probably a good estimate is that we have about 1 to 5%. We have fossils that represent approximately 1 to 5% of all species that have ever lived.
Wow.
And then he said in the dinosaur fossils, he says there's about 350 different species that can be identified, and 50% of those identified different species are known from one specimen.
Wow.
Which is itself incomplete. The specimen itself is so. My challenge to evolutionary theory is based on this principled epistemology of the sciences. How do sciences know what their data means? What is the kind of data with which they deal? And what can we say is true about that? And when you compare the kind of data that the Darwinist is met with the kind of data that either a botanist or marine biologist or somebody in the hard sciences is dealing with, you say, we don't have inductive access to a living species. We can't run multiple tests to develop an understanding of the nature of this object. It also defies precise mathematical quantification. So there's no inductive access, there's no precise quantification. They're medium sized objects that are themselves sometimes singular in their representation of an entire species. And I thought, how should we think about the theory that deals with that kind of evidence, Darwinian theory? Are we drawn more toward a realist judgment about the theory, the nature of the theory, or are we drawn more toward an anti-realist view? And my suggestion is that is that Darwinism, the kind of theory that it is, because of the paucity of its data, because of the lack of induction and the lack of quantification of the kind of data that it deals with, we should be drawn more toward an anti-realist understanding of what neo-Darwinism is doing as a theory. And this actually, I think, helps the Christian apologetics community because it explains why Darwinism as a theory is different than physics and chemistry,
Right.
because it has a different data set and it deals with that data set in a different way, in ways that we should be perhaps suspicious about Darwinian conclusions when we're not suspicious about the conclusions of physics and chemistry.
So, okay. So, I'm trying to figure out how to land the plane here. So, I when you're talking about a post-Darwinian design theory, it's if I'm understanding you, basically how I would explain what you're saying is ultimately what you're trying to show is that the philosophical presuppositions that Darwinian evolution sits upon is sort of importing realism, but really you're demonstrating that you would have to have an anti-realist view to make that work. Is that close?
Yeah, it's close, but it's better than that. It's this that many of the tensions in the current intelligent design neo-Darwinism debate assume realism.
Right.
They assume that Darwinism is either literally true or literally false.
Right.
And what my research suggests is that once we put in place the kind of eclecticism that J.P. Moreland desired, and we do it on Thomistic grounds, we note that neo-Darwinism isn't a kind of realist theory. It's more a kind of an anti-realist theory, specifically a kind of empirical construct. And what Bos van Frosland says about empirical constructs is that the assumptions in the framework are more important than the actual data. The assumptions in the framework are more heavily determine the way the data looks. So if we go back to what we said earlier, and what we said was that Meyer says that one of the things that Darwin does is he imposes a new conceptual framework on the data.
Mhm.
What I'm saying is that not only do we have pieces and parts of a new conceptual framework for the data, but understood as an anti-realist empirical construct, that is the most important part of understanding the data, is reframing it according to new assumptions. And when we do that, we get a new paradigm, a post-Darwinian paradigm. And then we bring intelligent design back in to interact with what that new paradigm says.
So what are the intelligent design theorists saying about this? Are they on board? Or are they hesitant about it? Or what are they saying?
Yeah. So when you defend your dissertation, you have a panel of experts, and I had William Dembski and John Lennox and our very own Richard Howe and Jay Richards. And I think at the time there was a question of, well, this is good, but I'm not sure what to do with it, which
Hmm.
may be the response of your audience as well. Um, but I think of it. I think of this as the next step in intelligent design.
Yeah.
Intelligent design,
Yeah.
in its heyday, did the work of clearing the road. I live in a cold climate, so I'm used to driving behind snowplows, and I really think that the work of the intelligent design community was to clear the road of the uh, the presumption of dogmatism that the Darwinists had for decades,
Yeah.
and really showing some of the empirical and maybe theoretical weaknesses of the paradigm, but without a sufficient alternative, right?
Right.
And so I think this actually completes the ID project in a way that
Cool.
now the I will say this, like we said earlier, scientists are more focused on the data than they are the nature of paradigms,
Mhm.
and many in the intelligent design community are scientists,
Right. They're not philosophers.
right? And so this is my explanation of why it seems obvious to me now after looking at this for 12, 13 years, Um, but this is why something like this might go undetected for so long,
Hmm.
because the scientists who are default realists are arguing about the truth or falsity of a scientific paradigm. And I said, well, scientists don't study scientific paradigms. Philosophers of science study
Hmm.
scientific paradigms. And then the question is, what kind of philosophy of science are you going to use? And then most philosophers of science are either going to be realists or anti-realists.
Right, right.
But with this sort of Moreland-esque eclecticism in place, we can say, no, I'm a realist when it comes to physics and chemistry. But when I look at the kind of data and the kind of access we have to natural history, it draws me toward anti-realism, specifically Van Frossen's constructivism.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it gives the Christian community a different way of arguing ultimately for a Christian worldview,
Hmm.
but in a way that transcends the sort of tit for tat arguing over specific data points. Because
Yeah.
there's really a debate to be had at the larger theoretical level.
Yeah, yeah, I wish that they would, part of, getting a higher degree in science would require some philosophy. I think that would be really maybe a helpful start, but I don't know if that'll happen anytime soon. But any final words? Let us know about your YouTube channel, your book. Can people order your book somewhere? Tell us all the
Yeah,
things.
yeah, it's on Amazon. We finished it up and it came out last August. So
And it's
Beyond
called Beyond
Origin.
Origin: A Post-Darwinian Design Theory. And then you have a YouTube
Yeah,
channel too, right?
I do. It's called a Considerate Life. So if you look up a Considerate Life, I posted a video end of February specifically on I think it's called After Darwin, exploring a post-Darwinian theory, where after months of thinking about it, I put together a very tight 24-minute video that it just explains in broad strokes the entire nature of the. So if you don't want to buy and read a book, fine, fair enough. Um, uh, at least go check out the video. It'll explain things in broad strokes.
Very good. Well, I want to thank my guest, Dr. J.T. Bridges, for joining today about this dense topic, but I know that there are some people just nerding out on this right now, loving it, and I really enjoyed that conversation. So let's remember as we pursue Christ to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.